The question of Marshal Kulik's place in the Red Army's transformation cannot be separated from the institutional shocks of the late 1930s. After the purges of 1937 to 1938 removed senior commanders across the service, the People's Commissariat of Defense faced simultaneous tasks: to rebuild a decapitated command cadre, to rearm an expanding force, and to reconcile competing doctrines on mechanization and firepower. The Soviet Union's geopolitical position intensified the pressure. The German invasion of Poland in September 1939, followed by the Western Campaign in May-June 1940, revealed a mobile operational method that fused armour, motorised infantry, artillery, and air power. In the same period, the USSR fought the Winter War against Finland, November 1939 to March 1940, which exposed limitations in combined arms coordination, communications, and logistics in difficult terrain. These events framed the debates in which Kulik operated as chief of the main artillery directorate and deputy People's Commissar of Defense. Kulik's professional identity was forged in artillery. Born in 1890, a veteran of the First World War and the Russian Civil War, he emerged as an advocate for centralized control over guns, ammunition, and sights, and for strict standardization of calibers. In 1937, he became head of the Main Artillery Directorate, a post that gave him leverage over procurement programs for divisional guns, anti-tank systems, and infantry weapons. In 1940, he was promoted to Marshal of the Soviet Union. These appointments placed him at the intersection of doctrine, industry, and field feedback, at a time when the Red Army was reassessing mechanization, whether to concentrate tanks in large independent formations or to redistribute armour to support rifle units more directly. The pre-war mechanization story began earlier in the decade with deep battle concepts articulated by Mikhail Tukhachevsky and operational theorists like Vladimir Triandafilov. Their vision prioritized shock groups with substantial armour and motorization to penetrate the enemy operational depth, disrupt reserves, and exploit to great distances. By 1936 to 1937, the Red Army fielded mechanized corps built around tank brigades, but uneven readiness, limited radios, weak truck parks, and training gaps produced mixed results in exercises. The upheavals of 1937 to 1938 then removed many of the doctrine's original champions. In this altered environment, artillery specialists and infantry commanders gained influence in shaping force structure, and risk tolerance in experimental organization declined. Events in 1939 to 1940 pushed the discussion in different directions. The Soviet campaign in eastern Poland, September 1939, provided only limited data on armoured operations. Resistance was brief and logistical chains were not stressed. The Winter War produced harder lessons. While heavy guns and massed fires eventually opened the Mannerheim Line, armoured units suffered from mines, anti-tank obstacles, poor visibility, and inadequate infantry cooperation. Tank casualties from non-combat causes, breakdowns, immobilization in forests and swamps were significant. Field reports emphasized the need for reliable communications, engineer support, and close infantry coordination, as well as for better high-explosive performance from divisional guns against strong points. These findings resonated with artillery authorities, who argued that fire preparation and methodical assault, not deep armoured thrusts, would decide outcomes in difficult theatres. At the same time, German operations in Poland and France demonstrated the operational potential of concentrated armour under unified motorised command, with Panzergruppe structures supported by corps level artillery and the Luftwaffe. Soviet observers noted the tempo of German advances and the role of radios in tactical control. But they also registered that German success depended on a balanced system. Tanks coordinated with engineers, reconnaissance, and air interdiction. Logistics kept pace with mobile units. Reserves arrived by motor transport to exploit breakthroughs. The contrast between Finnish defences in forest belts and German manoeuvre in open country complicated the Red Army's internal debate. Which scenario should drive organisation and procurement priorities? Industrial capacity added a further constraint. In 1939 to 1940, Soviet factories were transitioning toward new types, the T-34 and KV series, while still producing large numbers of T-26 and BT tanks. Artillery plants faced choices on caliber emphasis and manufacturing methods, especially for anti-tank guns and divisional pieces. Ammunition output had to match any decision on calibers, otherwise units would field weapons that could not be supplied at scale. Kulik's portfolio included authorizing or halting series production, pushing for standardization to ease logistics, and evaluating field complaints about reliability and ballistic performance. In this role, he frequently encountered reports that new systems required extensive rework at plant level before they could be issued broadly, while line units requested familiar equipment they knew how to maintain. Within the People's Commissariat and the General Staff, positions on mechanization diverged along practical lines. The Directorate of Armoured Forces advocated reconstituting large mechanized corps to concentrate striking power, a position strengthened by German results in 1940. Several senior infantry and artillery figures, including those responsible for training and mobilization, warned that the army lacked the communications equipment, motor transport, trained mechanics, and fuel services to sustain such corps in real operations. They favoured redistributing tanks to rifle divisions and cavalry to ensure combined arms at the divisional level and to reduce the logistical burden per formation. Kulik's interventions were framed in terms of supply feasibility, ammunition output, and the need to prioritise artillery modernisation as the backbone of offensive and defensive combat. Public sentiment and political oversight also shaped the environment. Official communications after the Winter War emphasised victory, but acknowledged initial difficulties. Internally, the leadership demanded rapid fixes. The Supreme Military Council, and later Stavka-level discussions in 1940, focused on two concurrent tracks: to accelerate the introduction of new armoured models while improving artillery support to overcome fortified zones. Mobilisation plans envisioned significant growth in the number of divisions, which multiplied the requirement for trained officers, radios, trucks, and repair workshops. By early 1941, plans to form multiple mechanised corps, each with 2 tank divisions and 1 motorised division, were approved, even as reports warned that many units would remain incomplete for months due to shortages in vehicles, specialists, and spare parts. Against this backdrop, Kulik's decisions and memoranda gained outsized impact because they translated institutional caution and industrial limitations into binding orders on what to produce, what to field, and how to structure fire support. He approached mechanization from the perspective of artillery integration, emphasizing reliable supply lines, standard calibers, and the need to balance new weapon types with the Army's capacity to train crews and maintain equipment. His critics within the armoured community saw such caution as a brake on concentration of tanks into operational formations. The stage was set for the clash between intent and capability that would define 1941, an army expanding faster than its training base, introducing new models faster than its maintenance network, and led by a high command still reconciling lessons from Finland and France. By the summer of 1940, the Red Army stood at a crossroads. The expansion program ordered after the annexation of the Baltic states and Bessarabia added hundreds of thousands of new conscripts and officers, many of them inexperienced. The General Staff under Boris Shaposhnikov began revising mobilization plans, estimating a wartime strength of more than 300 divisions. Within this structure, the question of how to employ tanks, whether as independent striking forces or as direct infantry support, became urgent. The Mechanization and Motorization Directorate proposed to restore the pre-purge concept of large mechanized corps. Kulik, as Deputy Commissar of Defense and Head of Artillery Development, strongly opposed this plan. In his view, the Soviet industrial base could not yet support such formations with adequate artillery, fuel, and repair services. He advocated smaller tank brigades integrated with rifle corps, ensuring what he called realistic coordination of fire and movement. Between August and December 1940, a series of high-level conferences at the Kremlin and the People's Commissariat of Defense exposed the divide within the command. Reports presented by the Directorate of Armored Forces, led by Lieutenant General Dmitry Pavlov and later Yakov Fedorenko, demonstrated that Germany had employed roughly 10 panzer divisions in France under 2 Panzergruppen, achieving operational breakthroughs that encircled entire field armies. Soviet planners suggested that restoring mechanized corps with 2 tank divisions each would mirror this model. Kulik countered with detailed memoranda, arguing that the Red Army lacked sufficient motor transport to supply such units, and that tanks, without adequate artillery and air cover, would suffer catastrophic losses. His memoranda to the State Defense Committee cited figures. Of approximately 25,000 tanks on inventory, fewer than half were fully operational, and less than 1/3 had radios. He emphasized the need to prioritize anti-tank guns, mortars, and divisional artillery before pursuing mass mechanization. The issue came to a head in January 1941 during the Winter Strategic Games held at the General Staff Academy. 2 scenarios were played, a Western offensive by a blue force modelled on the Wehrmacht, and a counter-operation by the red side. Marshal Kulik served as one of the referees overseeing artillery coordination. The results reinforced his skepticism. Units attempting deep exploitation quickly outran their logistics and lost contact with supporting artillery. Communications lag meant that orders from front headquarters often arrived hours after conditions had changed. Reports concluded that operational maneuver required not only tanks, but a synchronized command structure and trained signals personnel. Stalin, attending parts of the exercise, noted both the promise and the danger of over-reliance on mechanized mass without supporting infrastructure. In February 1941, a compromise emerged. The State Defense Committee approved the creation of 29 mechanized corps, each to include over 1,000 tanks, while authorizing simultaneous rearmament of artillery units. Kulik, though overruled on organizational grounds, retained authority over weapons procurement and production priorities. His directives curtailed the manufacture of certain light tank models and pressed for the continuation of the 76.2mm divisional gun modernization program. He insisted that the infantry and artillery arm must not be starved for the sake of tank prestige. Minutes from a March 1941 conference record, his assertion that the battlefield is not conquered by movement alone, but by the destruction of enemy fire systems. His statements reflected a doctrinal continuity rooted in the Civil War and early 1930s, when mobility was subordinated to concentrated artillery preparation. Meanwhile, the armoured industry was under pressure to accelerate the T-34 and KV programs. Reports from Plant Number 183 in Kharkov and Kirov works in Leningrad detailed production delays and component shortages. Engines, gearboxes, and optics failed quality standards in 20 to 30% of cases. Kulik's department criticised the premature introduction of new designs before field testing was complete, citing risks of mechanical failure and ammunition mismatches. The main artillery directorate demanded that new tank guns conform to existing ballistic tables to simplify shell production. Designers like Vasily Grabin, who led the F-34 gun project, faced resistance until direct intervention by Stalin allowed the weapon's adoption. Thus, the bureaucratic struggle over gun calibers and mountings became an extension of the larger dispute over doctrine itself. Throughout the spring of 1941, correspondence between Kulik the General Staff, and the Commissariat of Armaments revealed the tension between urgency and feasibility. The German build-up across the Bug and Niemen rivers was evident in reconnaissance reports, yet the Red Army's reorganization was far from complete. Out of the 29 mechanized corps authorized, only half existed even on paper. Most had received fewer than 400 tanks. The shortage of trucks was critical. Mechanized corps required about 1,500 vehicles each, but deliveries covered barely 1/4 of that. Training facilities were overloaded and fuel reserves insufficient for sustained maneuvers. Kulik's memoranda to Stalin in May 1941 warned that the army is not ready for an offensive war of engines and advocated strengthening border artillery positions instead. His position, couched in logistical realism, was interpreted by some colleagues as defeatism. When the German invasion began on 22 June 1941, the consequences of the incomplete transformation became visible immediately. Mechanized corps were ordered into counterattacks from the Baltic to Ukraine, often with incomplete formations and no air cover. The Red Army lost approximately 10,000 tanks within the first 3 weeks, more than any other army had fielded in total. While mechanical failures, encirclement, and airstrikes accounted for most of the losses, critics within the Stavka soon cited pre-war decisions that had delayed the creation of unified armoured command. Kulik's earlier insistence on decentralization now appeared disastrous, yet archival materials show that his objections had been based less on ideology than on arithmetic. He doubted that an army short of radios, trucks, and repair units could sustain mobile operations on the German model. His caution, intended as prudence, became retroactively framed as obstruction. In the crisis atmosphere of July-August 1941, Kulik's responsibilities shifted. Appointed representative of Stavka on several fronts, he was sent to supervise artillery organization during defensive operations near Smolensk and later in the north. His reports from these sectors described shortages of ammunition, the need to reform the command of frontline artillery, and the disintegration of supply routes under Luftwaffe attack. By autumn, his authority and reputation were both in decline. Nevertheless, his influence over doctrine persisted through the orders he had issued between 1939 and 1941, orders that determined which weapons were built, which formations received priority, and how the Red Army entered the most destructive war in its history. Strategic planning in 1939 to 1941 unfolded along parallel tracks that often contradicted one another. At the institutional level, the General Staff sought to rebuild a comprehensive operational doctrine, deep operations with echeloned formations, a developed reconnaissance and signals network, and mobile reserves capable of exploitation, while the People's Commissariat of Defense wrestled with resource ceilings set by industry. The dissolution of pre-war mechanized corps in late 1939 redistributed armor into separate tank brigades and motorized divisions to strengthen rifle formations and to reduce the demand for radios, trucks, and trained mechanics at corps scale. Kulik's memoranda framed this reorganization as a logistics stabilizer. Standardized calibers and predictable ammunition supply for divisional artillery would, in his view, create a firmer base for later mechanization. In practice, the redistribution lowered the ceiling for independent operational maneuver, just as neighboring powers demonstrated it. Inside the Soviet command, goals were defined with a mixture of caution and ambition. A series of directives from late 1940 through spring 1941 prioritized the modernization of divisional guns and mortars, the expansion of anti-tank defense in border districts, and the accelerated production of new medium and heavy tanks. The approved plan for 29 mechanized corps, each notionally over 1,000 tanks, with organic artillery and motor transport, represented the ambitious track. The cautious track, reinforced by Kulik and several senior infantry commanders, aimed to ensure that Rifle Corps possessed adequate artillery preparation and that the supply system could sustain multi-day battles. The contradiction was visible in numbers, even if only 15 mechanized corps were brought to 60% strength. The truck requirement climbed above 20,000 vehicles, while the rail network had to deliver fuel, shells, and spare parts to forward depots within hours. Production plans promised capacity. Mobilization tables showed gaps in trained drivers, radio operators, and repair crews. German planning set the external frame to these internal debates. By early 1941, Army Group Center's concept combined armored spearheads with fast-moving infantry, massed engineer assets, and close air support to break front lines, drive on Minsk and Smolensk, and encircle Soviet armies west of the Dnieper. The Luftwaffe's operational goal was to suppress Soviet aviation on the ground in the first days, and then to interdict reserves and arrear services. In comparative terms, Army Group Center allocated roughly 1,700 to 2,000 serviceable tanks and 1,000 to 1,200 aircraft for the opening phase. In the Western Special Military District, the Red Army listed several thousand tanks of mixed types, but radio equipment and serviceable aircraft were fewer, and maintenance echelons were thinner. Soviet planners understood these disparities unevenly. Intelligence reported German concentrations, yet the time needed to complete the new command structure exceeded the probable window before hostilities. Within the Soviet apparatus, the Stavka-level meetings of early 1941 attempted to reconcile doctrine with means. The operational objective remained consistent: disrupt a German offensive by counterblows delivered by mechanized corps, supported by army and front artillery groups, and then carry the war onto enemy territory to secure depth and better economic bases. Logistics tables, however, indicated that fuel stocks near border districts did not cover prolonged maneuver, and that ammunition reserves were concentrated in depots vulnerable to air attack. Kulik's position inside these discussions stressed the sequencing of priorities. First, guarantee divisional firepower with reliable 76.2mm guns, 122mm howitzers, and mortars. Second, standardize fuses and propellant charges to simplify production. Third, expand anti-tank density at rifle division level. Only then expand fully motorized exploitation forces. The Armored Forces Directorate, comparing German 1940 practice, argued that without concentrated armored formations, the counterblow concept would fail, regardless of artillery preparation. Procurement conflicts mapped directly onto operational goals. The F-34 tank gun, whose adoption would give T-34 units improved armor penetration and commonality with existing ammunition cycles, collided with Kulik's insistence on conformance to established ballistic tables and on avoiding untested series production. Artillery modernization demanded optical sights, rangefinders, and fire direction equipment in quantities that competed with tank optics. Radio plants had to divide output between mechanized corps headquarters, tank companies, and artillery command vehicles. Each allocation choice carried operational meaning. A tank company without radios could not execute rapid platoon-level maneuvers. An artillery regiment without reliable communications could not shift fire to support tanks that broke into the enemy tactical depth. Training plans further constrained the relationship between objectives and means. The 1941 schedule called for field camps to train newly formed artillery regiments in rapid survey and fire adjustment, while mechanized corps were to conduct multi-day marches with refueling and maintenance halts under simulated air attack. Fuel allotments and vehicle wear rates limited execution. A mechanized corps needed more than 300,000 litres of fuel for a 2-day maneuver cycle. Districts frequently received half the requirement. Workshops lacked spare gearboxes and clutches for new types. Tank crews rotated through shortened courses, gaining gunnery practice but little experience with field repairs. Kulik's staff insisted that artillery units, once standardized and adequately supplied, could offset shortfalls in tank proficiency by breaking German fire systems at the start lines of counterattacks. armoured commanders replied that without rapid manoeuvre, the artillery would be outrun and exposed to interdiction. Propaganda and public messaging reflected the same dualism. Official newspapers praised new tanks and heavy guns, highlighting industrial capacity and rapid deliveries. Internal bulletins circulated to commanders emphasized discipline in ammunition expenditure, the necessity of camouflage for depots and parks, and the importance of dispersal to survive the first strike. The aim was deterrence through the image of readiness while preserving operational secrecy. In practice, visible concentration of newly formed mechanized corps near rail nodes created targets, and the late arrival of replacement radios and trucks meant that publicized figures masked the percentage of fully combat-capable vehicles. By June 1941, the operational plans were fixed in principle but incomplete in execution. Fronts planned to use mechanized corps as mobile reserves for counterblows along axes like Grodno-Bialystok and Vladimir-Volinsky-Lutsk-Rovno, while army and front artillery groups would mass fires to enable the initial counterstroke. The Red Army could count tens of thousands of guns and mortars and more tanks than the invader, but the share of serviceable equipment on any given day, the density of radios and the depth of fuel stocks remained the decisive variables. Kulik's influence was embedded in these numbers. His push for artillery standardization had raised the availability of shells and fuses in rifle formations, yet his resistance to rapid adoption of certain systems delayed some improvements in armored firepower and communications. The strategic goal, deny the enemy operational freedom and transition to offensive action, stood intact on paper. The planning reality was a compromise between doctrine and logistics, with timing and coordination as the unresolved problems that would determine the outcome once the opening blows fell. The opening phase after 22nd June 1941 exposed the unresolved contradictions between design and capability. In the Western Special Military District, aircraft destroyed on forward airfields and disrupted rail traffic delayed the concentration of artillery and mechanized reserves. Army Group Center's panzer groups crossed the Niemen and Bug and drove toward Grodno and Volkovysk, while the Red Army attempted counterblows with composite groupings built from incomplete mechanized corps and rifle divisions short of transport. In the Bialystok-Minsk sector, 3rd, 10th, and parts of 13th Armies were pressed from multiple directions. Artillery headquarters struggled to establish fire plans because telephone lines were cut and radio nets were incomplete. Gun regiments often fired on pre-war grid references without aerial correction. Ammunition depots positioned close to the frontier for offensive readiness became vulnerable to air raids and rapid penetrations, complicating resupply. The result was a widening gap between the authorized design of artillery groups and what could be brought to bear at a given hour. In comparative terms, Army Group Center fielded around 1,700 to 2,000 serviceable tanks and more than 1,000 operational aircraft for the opening strikes, while the Western Front listed several thousand tanks on paper across multiple districts, but with a low share of radios and a high percentage undergoing repair. Soviet counterattacks near Grodno and Lida committed tank brigades and elements of mechanized corps piecemeal, often against moving targets without synchronized artillery. When batteries did mass, shell expenditure norms, set high for breakthrough tasks, could not be sustained because trains with propellant and fuses were rerouted or destroyed. Field reports noted that 76.2mm divisional guns performed reliably against soft targets and anti-tank positions, but the density of fires fell off within hours as stocks ran down. The encirclement at Minsk by early July removed tens of thousands of personnel and large quantities of equipment from the order of battle and pushed the front line eastward to the Dnieper and western Divina. Farther south, the battle in the Lutsk-Dubno-Brody triangle illustrated the scale mismatch between commitment and sustainment. The Southwestern Front assembled several mechanized corps, 8th, 9th, 15th, 19th, and 22nd, whose combined tank inventory exceeded 2,000 vehicles, while the opposing 1st Panzer Group fielded approximately 800 to 900 tanks. Soviet formations launched a series of counterattacks between 24 and 30 June across multiple axes. On paper, the concentration promised a local numerical advantage. In execution, coordination faltered. Some corps advanced without sufficient reconnaissance. Others collided with German spearheads at road junctions where artillery support could not be brought forward in time. Fuel shortages forced night halts that broke momentum. German units maintained continuous radio control and shifted anti-tank guns and dive bombers to threatened sectors within hours. By the end of the first week, the Soviet Mechanized Corps had lost a large share of their vehicles to combat, breakdowns, and abandonment, while German panzer divisions retained cohesion and continued east. On the northern flank, the Northwestern Front withdrew from the Baltic states toward the Pskov-Ostrov line under pressure from Army Group North. Here, the problem for artillery was movement. Heavy howitzers and corps guns required road and bridge capacities that could not be guaranteed during a retreat, and many pieces were scuttled after demolition charges failed to fire or were set too late. The arrival of improvised anti-tank barriers in towns bought hours rather than days. Kulik, dispatched as a Stavka representative to the northern sector in July, urged the creation of front artillery groups to cover key crossings and directed the redistribution of 76.2mm guns to rifle divisions forming defensive nodes. He also pressed for field expedients, the transformation of spare aircraft machine guns into improvised anti-air mounts, and the use of captured Czech and Polish shells, where chamber dimensions allowed. These measures increased the density of fire at choke points, but could not reverse operational trends driven by mobility and sustained logistics. The first weeks also revealed the consequences of pre-war choices in infantry anti-tank defense. The Red Army had curtailed anti-tank rifle development in 1940 on the ground that contemporary armour would defeat such weapons at combat ranges. With German tanks in 1941 still vulnerable on side plates to large-caliber rifle fire at short distance, the decision was revisited. Kulik's directorate, under pressure from field commands, reauthorized production of 14.5mm anti-tank rifles and accelerated the supply of 45mm anti-tank guns. This reversal exemplified a broader pattern. Procurement policy adjusted quickly to battlefield data, but industrial lead times meant that new weapons would influence the fighting only months later. During the summer, infantry companies in many sectors relied on a mix of 45mm guns, grenades, and demolitions, with limited training in coordinated ambush tactics. German accounts from the same period describe frequent small-scale engagements where Soviet guns inflicted losses at close range, but were overrun when maneuver elements outflanked positions lacking depth. Civilian experience ran in parallel with these military events. Evacuation of factories and skilled workers from Belarus and Ukraine proceeded under air attack and rail congestion, while front headquarters requisitioned trucks and tractors to move guns and ammunition. In Minsk, Vitebsk, and Smolensk, municipal authorities organized depot clearance and hospital transfers in days rather than weeks. Many medical trains departed without full records as registry offices were overrun. German occupation policies introduced new administrative structures while securing rail lines for further advances. The immediate effect on local populations included shortages of food and medicine, new labour regulations, and the disruption of family networks as reservists and factory workers moved east. The speed of territorial change increased uncertainty and complicated intelligence for both sides. Soviet reports from partisans and remaining local officials varied in reliability, while German rear area units allocated to security duties diverted manpower from the front. By mid-July, the Smolensk region became the first operational pause for Army Group Center. Soviet reserves launched attacks from the north and south of the city, attempting to cut the roads to Yatsevo and Roslavl. Artillery regrouped along shorter internal lines showed greater effect, particularly when front headquarters succeeded in concentrating guns by the dozen rather than by scattered batteries. Kulik's dispatches from the sector emphasized the need for uninterrupted ammunition flow and proposed standardizing fire planning procedures across armies to reduce delays in switching targets. German operational reports for this period recorded higher daily ammunition expenditure than in late June and more frequent requests for air interdiction against Soviet batteries. Yet the structural imbalance remained. Panzer divisions, even with lower tank strengths, retained the initiative because their signals and logistics systems were intact, while Soviet mechanized corps had been degraded below the threshold for sustained counter-offensive action. In the Leningrad direction, the Luga defensive line formed in July combined field fortifications, ad hoc strongpoints, and concentrations of guns and mortars. Kulik supported the distribution of artillery by sectors with assigned kill zones on approaches and advocated centralized control of fire when communications permitted. The method slowed the advance of Army Group North and demonstrated that, under conditions of prepared defense, Soviet artillery could impose costs and shape maneuver corridors. However, the shortage of tractors and prime movers limited the ability to reposition heavy pieces in response to breakthroughs. Once German units forced crossings and seized road junctions, batteries that could not displace were either abandoned or destroyed. The pattern of partial success followed by forced withdrawal characterized multiple sectors in the first 2 months. Tactical achievements where fires were massed and coordinated, operational setbacks where mobility and supply determined outcomes. Across these fronts, the early clashes clarified the boundaries of doctrine under stress. Concentration of armor without fuel, radios, and repair echelons did not produce operational encirclements. Massed artillery without stable communications could not reliably support mobile counterattacks. Kulik's long-standing emphasis on artillery preparation found confirmation in prepared defenses and at river lines. Yet his skepticism toward rapid mechanized concentration conflicted with the need to generate mobile reserves capable of striking operationally. German forces exploited the gap between Soviet intent and Soviet means, while Soviet commands adapted by shortening fronts, rationalizing supply routes, and revising procurement priorities. The first engagements thus established both the immediate strategic picture and the set of practical problems, communications, logistics, and training, that subsequent operations would try to solve. The months after the initial encirclements shifted the conflict from rapid penetrations to a prolonged struggle over corridors, river lines, and rail junctions. Soviet headquarters shortened fronts, rebuilt shattered armies, and improvised counteroffensives to restore a continuous line from Lake Ladoga to the Upper Don. The tempo forced a redefinition of priorities. The General Staff sought to reconstitute mechanized capability, even as it stabilized rifle formations with artillery. Stavka directives in July-September 1941 ordered the formation of new tank brigades for immediate counterattack tasks, while reserving the long-term goal of re-establishing mechanized corps. Artillery was reorganized into stronger army and front groups with centralized fire control, and reserve formations were created to plug gaps. In this environment, Kulik's authority was both constrained and visible. Removed from daily control of the main artillery directorate, he served as Stavka representative in threatened sectors and argued for massed fires to anchor defensive lines, while his earlier procurement decisions continued to shape what equipment reached units and in what quantities. Lost data from the summer confronted the leadership with material realities. Between late June and September, Soviet front reports registered the destruction or abandonment of many thousands of tanks and a comparable depletion of motor transport, with a high proportion of write-offs attributed to mechanical failure or lack of fuel. Aircraft replacement lagged behind operational losses in multiple districts. Ammunition expenditure spiked during large counterblows, but the location of major depots near the frontier complicated replenishment after German breakthroughs. The response was institutional. Stavka began forming centralized artillery reserves under its direct control, rationalizing calibers for divisional and corps guns, and increasing the density of anti-tank weapons in rifle divisions. Field improvisations, wireless discipline rules, camouflaged refueling points, and pre-planned demolition of depots were codified into orders to reduce the vulnerability of supply nodes. Escalation around Leningrad created a distinctive set of demands. As Army Group North pushed toward the Neva, the Soviet command built layered defenses along the Luga and later along the approaches to the city, concentrating guns and mortars by sector and assigning fixed fire plans keyed to bridges and road choke points. Kulik, acting as a Stavka envoy in the northern direction, supported the creation of front-level artillery groups and the redistribution of 76.2mm guns to newly mobilized rifle formations defending crossings and rail terminals. Reports from the sector emphasized the utility of coordinated fires in forest and marsh terrain, where movement by heavy howitzers was limited, and the timing of barrages became decisive. German records from the same period note increased ammunition expenditure in forcing crossings and more frequent calls for airstrikes against Soviet batteries, indicating that concentrated artillery temporarily offset gaps in maneuver units, an outcome consistent with Kulik's insistence that fire, rather than movement alone, could hold a defensive line. Political pressure rose in parallel with military demands. Stavka minutes from late summer show a sharpening focus on accountability for pre-war decisions about mechanization, radios, and anti-tank defense. Investigative commissions reviewed procurement files on tank guns and divisional artillery, including cases where adoption of new systems had been delayed by technical objections or production disputes. Kulik's memoranda defending standardization and caution in series production were read against battlefield reports requesting more powerful tank armament and a rapid increase in anti-tank density. The contradiction was not purely personal. It reflected different risk tolerances within the institution. One side prioritized reliability in supply and maintenance. The other argued that without embracing new systems at scale, the army would continue to lose mobile battles. The findings did not produce a single verdict, but they informed revisions to production plans for late 1941 and early 1942. International factors entered the calculus as the crisis deepened. Soviet requests for vehicles, radios, and aluminum highlighted the bottlenecks constraining both mechanized operations and artillery communications. Early external deliveries were modest in volume but important in type, particularly motor transport suited to towing guns and moving ammunition. These inputs did not resolve immediate shortages, yet they influenced planning for winter operations by enabling the formation of more mobile artillery groups. German assessments, for their part, recognized the Red Army's capacity to generate new formations despite heavy losses and warned that extended supply lines and winter conditions would degrade the pace of operations. The contest thus moved toward attrition shaped by logistics and weather, not only by the number of tanks present on a given axis. The crisis around Smolensk and the approaches to Moscow brought the doctrinal conflict into sharper relief. Soviet counteroffensives in August and September assembled tank brigades in sequences of short thrusts, with artillery massed to open corridors and to interdict German lateral roads. Where communications held, batteries shifted fire ahead of advancing battalions and disrupted German attempts to stabilize flanks. Where radio nets failed, attacks broke into disconnected actions. Front directives stressed combined use of artillery and tanks at regiment and brigade levels, but the speed of events often forced piecemeal commitment. Kulik's dispatches from these sectors urged the standardization of fire plans across armies to speed target switching and called for additional radio sets in artillery command posts to match the mobility of tank groups. The recommendations reflected his long-standing view. Without reliable communication and ammunition flow, the promise of mechanized mass could not be realized in practice. The approach of winter imposed further constraints and opportunities. Frozen ground allowed the movement of heavy guns across terrain that had previously trapped prime movers, while low temperatures increased mechanical failures in vehicles on both sides. Soviet planners used the pause to complete the formation of additional tank brigades and to expand the centralized artillery reserve. Orders detailed the creation of special anti-tank strongpoints along likely approach routes to Moscow, each with assigned fields of fire, mine belts, and pre-registered artillery targets. German plans for a final push required concentrating fuel and ammunition over long supply lines under deteriorating weather and increasing partisan activity. In comparative terms, both sides confronted attrition in material and personnel. The balance depended on which command could re-establish coordination between maneuver and fire support at the operational level. Administrative measures paralleled the tactical ones. Training programs for artillery survey and fire direction were shortened but made more uniform, with new manuals circulated to standardize the sequence from observation to fire adjustment. Tank crews received accelerated gunnery instruction, with an emphasis on quick acquisition and short halts to fire, acknowledging that long stationary engagements increased vulnerability to air attack and anti-tank guns. Factories evacuated east resumed production on revised schedules, and procurement orders specified interchangeability of fuses and propellant charges across multiple gun models to simplify distribution. These changes, many of which reflected arguments Kulik had made about standardization, aimed to reduce friction in the supply chain, even as formation tables remained ambitious. The question of responsibility remained open and contentious. Commanders at front and army level argued that equipment shortfalls and organizational turbulence explained operational setbacks. Central authorities pointed to instances where units with comparable equipment achieved different results due to command and control. Kulik's pre-war opposition to rapid mechanized concentration, his reservations about certain weapon adoptions, and his emphasis on artillery as the decisive arm were scrutinized in light of the summer's outcomes. Yet the same documents that criticized his caution endorsed a strategy for winter operations grounded in massed fires, layered defenses, and limited counter-thrusts. A strategy aligned with the arguments he had advanced since 1940. The escalation thus sharpened, but did not resolve the core debate: how to balance firepower, mobility, and logistics under conditions of industrial strain and continual field losses. As 1941 closed, the Red Army prepared for winter counter-offensives that would test the revised balance. Army and front artillery groups were larger and more centralized. Tank brigades had clearer tasks within combined arms frameworks. Supply plans prioritized ammunition and fuel corridors to sectors chosen for local superiority. German forces still holding large salients faced stretched communications and the need to winterize equipment and shelter troops. The crisis phase had transformed initial improvisation into a more coherent, if still incomplete, system. Kulik's influence persisted through the structures and standards embedded in orders and production lines, even as his personal standing within the high command wavered under scrutiny. Winter 1941 to 1942 brought the fighting around Leningrad to its most intense phase, as both commands sought a decisive outcome on the Volkhov-Lyuban axis. The Soviet intention was to break the siege by severing German rail communications south of the city and by forcing a junction between formations advancing from the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts. The Lyuban offensive opened in early January 1942 with converging tasks. From the east, the newly formed Second Shock Army crossed the frozen Volkhov and pushed west toward Lyuban. From the west, 54th Army attacked through the forests and swamps around Pogorstaye and the Magatosno rail sector. The German 18th Army, covering the approaches to Leningrad, relied on infantry divisions entrenched in forest belts with strongpoints along rail lines and roads, supported by field artillery and mobile reserves for counterattacks. The terrain, low ridges, peat bogs, and sparse winter roads, shaped operations more than either side's design. Force composition reflected the constraints accumulated since the summer. Second shock. Army assembled rifle divisions and separate brigades reinforced with limited armour and strong artillery groupings. 54th Army fielded a mix of rifle divisions, ski battalions, and tank brigades with small numbers of serviceable medium tanks. German formations in the sector, elements of several infantry divisions with attached assault guns and anti-tank units, held a continuous line tied to villages and river bends. In numerical terms, local Soviet concentrations often outnumbered the defenders at chosen break-in sectors, but motor transport, radio density, and engineer support were insufficient to sustain wide-front exploitation. The operational objective demanded a rapid breach and expansion. The available means allowed penetration along narrow corridors that were vulnerable to counterattack. The peak of the offensive came in February-March 1942. Second Shock Army advanced 60 to 75 kilometers into the German rear toward the Lyuban area, creating a salient supported by a supply corridor across the Volkhov, only a few kilometers wide. The corridor's capacity depended on winter roads over swamps, with sled trains and limited truck columns moving at night to avoid observation. Artillery ammunition, fuel, and rations reached forward units irregularly, and evacuation of wounded lagged behind the rate of casualties. On the western side, 54th Army's attacks toward Maga and Tosno achieved local gains, but failed to break through the German second line, where Soviet artillery massed to 100 guns per kilometre on narrow sectors. Initial strongpoints were reduced, but the ability to shift fire and bring forward guns over churned tracks declined after the first day. German units stabilized threatened points by moving anti-tank guns, exchanging infantry between regiments, and requesting airstrikes when weather permitted. Command decisions during these weeks were shaped by incomplete information. Front headquarters in Leningrad and on the Volkhov assessed that a coordinated effort could encircle German forces around Lyuban and open a land corridor to the city. Reports rising from division and corps levels described the corridor to Second Shock Army as precarious and warned that thaw conditions would soon reduce load capacity. The German 18th Army, reading the same terrain, prioritized cutting the supply neck while containing 54th Army. By mid-March, German counterattacks at the base of the salient narrowed the passage further. Soviet attempts to widen it included renewed assaults by the 54th Army toward the Emgar junction and by army groups east of the Volkhov to clear lateral roads. Ammunition expenditure rose on both sides. Daily rates of fire in the sector increased, but resupply favored the defender whose lines ran along existing railways. Civilian conditions influenced the urgency and the risk calculus. Leningrad's food stocks remained tight despite winter shipments across Lake Ladoga, and the promise of restoring a land connection carried weight beyond the military map. Evacuation trains carried factory equipment and civilians over ice and later by boat. Simultaneous demands for transport to move artillery shells and fuel toward the front stretched capacity. Local populations in villages along the axes of advance experienced rapid turnovers of control, requisitions of food and horses, and forced labour to build corduroy roads and bunkers. For both commands, the presence of civilians in the combat zone complicated logistics and increased the need for security detachments to protect supply lines against raids and to manage evacuations. Operationally, the intensity peaked as the seasonal thaw began. Snowmelt turned forest trails into deep mud, prime movers failed at higher rates, and artillery displacement slowed. Second Shock Army, already operating at the end of a narrow logistics funnel, faced an accelerating shortage of fuel and shells. Requests for relief placed greater responsibility on the 54th Army to break through from the west. Attacks were renewed with additional tank brigades and concentrated artillery, but German defences, anchored on villages with mutually supporting fields of fire, absorbed the blows. The gap between planned tempo and achievable tempo widened. Batteries could prepare a breach in hours, but the movement of infantry and tanks to exploit it took days over poor roads, by which time reserves had arrived to seal the opening. High command interventions reflected the stakes. Stavka representatives, including officers with artillery portfolios, reviewed fire planning and urged tighter synchronization between infantry, tanks and guns at the battalion and regiment level. Orders emphasized pre-registration of targets, redundant communications between observation posts and batteries, and the creation of forward ammunition dumps to shorten the resupply loop. On the German side, directives mandated immediate counter-thrusts against any Soviet penetration beyond the first line and the systematic mining of likely approach routes. The result was a pattern of short-lived gains and rapid tactical ripostes that increased casualties without converting them into operational depth. The cumulative effect by early April was a salient under pressure and an army west of the Volkhov that had not achieved a junction. German forces intensified efforts to cut the corridor, using artillery concentrations on choke points and interdiction fire on winter roads that had become narrow causeways of mud. Soviet attempts to rotate exhausted divisions and to feed fresh brigades into the fight encountered the physical limitations of the route and the exhaustion of prime movers. Casualty reporting on both sides recorded high losses in assault units and in artillery crews exposed while bringing guns forward under fire. The strategic picture shifted from an encirclement attempt to a contest over the survival of the salient itself. With relief forces unable to achieve the lateral linkage required to transform tactical penetrations into a stable corridor. Within this peak phase, assessments of command performance diverged. Documents from Leningrad and Volkhov headquarters pointed to insufficient coordination between neighbouring armies, inadequate engineer support for road building, and delays in switching fires to suppress German counterattack assembly areas. German after-action reports credited the terrain, interdiction of supply, and timely commitment of reserves. In the debate over institutional lessons, artillery advocates argued that where dense continuous fire systems were established, advances occurred. Armoured commanders noted that without sustained mobility, such gains could not be extended. The winter peak thus crystallised a larger problem identified throughout the campaign. Plans that required simultaneous speed and mass collided with a battle space that penalised movement and communications, turning the decisive phase into a prolonged attritional struggle centred on supply corridors rather than sweeping manoeuvres. Adaptation on both sides during spring 1942 was driven less by doctrine than by the need to keep men, guns and rations moving across impassable ground. Along the Volkhov, rifle divisions were reorganised into assault groups built around sappers, submachine gunners, and close support guns, with mortars concentrated to 50 to 70 tubes per kilometre on narrow sectors. Forward observers were pushed to tree lines and church towers with wire reels and signal flags. Redundant lines were laid because breaks were frequent. Supply officers converted horse sleighs to spring wagons as thaw advanced, and corduroy roads were extended one plank line at a time by engineer battalions and labour detachments drawn from local populations. Where artillery could not displace, ammunition was hauled forward to create forward dumps, allowing short bursts of high-density fire to cover platoon and company rushes through village belts. The intention was to turn short windows of local superiority into incremental ground. 54th Army attempted to institutionalise these expedients. Orders formalised two-day cycles. Night movement to jumping-off points, dawn barrages pre-registered on houses, road forks and suspected anti-tank nests, and midday pauses to restore wire and pull-up guns. Tank brigades were parceled out as company-sized detachments to infantry regiments, with liaison officers assigned to each battery to reduce delays in target switching. To compensate for the scarcity of reliable radios, runners carried standardized fire request cards, specifying grid squares and durations. Kulik, as army commander, endorsed the use of fixed artillery schedules that could run even if communications failed, a method consistent with his emphasis on fire as the controlling arm. At the same time, he ordered the formation of mobile anti-tank groups within rifle divisions, built around 45mm guns and the newly issued 14.5mm rifles, to strengthen flanks during penetration attempts. These measures improved tactical cohesion at specific points, but required precise timing and sustained ammunition flow that the road network could not always deliver. German formations adapted in parallel. Infantry regiments in the Leoben sector converted villages into mutually supporting strongpoints with interlocking fields of fire, registered mortar and artillery targets on likely assembly areas, and organized rapid counterattack groups backed by assault guns where terrain permitted. Anti-tank guns, predominantly 50mm, with growing numbers of 75mm pieces, were sited to cover road exits and narrow forest rides. Mine belts were extended with wire obstacles to channel attackers. Division and corps staffs standardized a playbook: permit initial Soviet gains into gaps between strong points, then strike laterally against the flanks while artillery interdicted the roads behind the breach. When weather allowed, close air support targeted bridges and winter road crossings, a pattern that had an outsized effect on narrow supply corridors. Resource management became decisive. The capacity of the Volkhof corridor supplying Second Shock Army was measured in trains of sleds and limited truck columns. As Thor progressed, each trip carried less tonnage and consumed more time and fuel. To preserve artillery effect under these limits, Soviet staffs prioritized propellant charges and fuses for 76.2mm guns and mortars, reduced high-explosive shell allowances for tank guns in favor of armor piercing, and moved heavy howitzers only when a crossing could be secured for more than a day. Air resupply was attempted with light aircraft to deliver medical supplies and specialty items, but bulk ammunition and fuel remained roadbound. On the Leningrad side of the front, shipments across Lake Ladoga continued, but their primary destination was the city's subsistence and industry. Allocations to offensive sectors were constrained by competing needs. Innovation at small unit level was continuous. Sapper platoons carried prefabricated fascines to fill anti-tank ditches under smoke from mortar batteries. Infantry squads improvised sled harnesses to drag 45mm guns forward with 2 horses and 8 men when tractors failed. Tank crews fitted additional track links to hull fronts to resist 50mm armor-piercing rounds and learned to use short halts to fire in coordination with planned mortar lifts. Artillery battalions adopted simplified fire plans with named target boxes and standard 3-minute concentrations to reduce chatter on compromised lines. German units responded with night raids to cut wire, patrols to identify new observation posts, and rapid displacement of anti-tank guns by horse team to avoid pre-registered counter-battery fire. Neither side sought novelty for its own sake. Each sought reliability in an environment where a broken bridge or a single demolished culvert could stall a battalion. Morale fluctuated with logistics and weather. Soviet infantry, who saw ammunition arrive on time and tanks positioned forward, reported higher confidence and pressed attacks. Units that waited under observed assembly areas while wire was repaired incurred casualties without movement and recorded lower readiness for renewed assaults. German companies that rotated through strong points with predictable rations and relief maintained cohesion. Formations fixed in place for extended periods in forests with poor shelter reported rising sickness and fatigue. Medical services on both sides struggled with evacuation over collapsing roads. Casualty clearing stations west of the Volkhov faced shortages of dressings and fuel. German aid posts in forward villages were frequently shelled during Soviet preparation fires aimed at road junctions. Commanders at regimental and divisional level adjusted tasks to reduce cumulative stress, but operational requirements often overrode these measures. Command relationships adapted under pressure. 54th Army attempted to shorten lines by giving artillery group commanders authority to approve local shifts of fire without waiting for Army permission, provided they stayed within pre-allocated daily shell limits. Corps and division headquarters created liaison teams to sit in neighbouring command posts, exchanging target lists and timing tables to synchronise lifts and pauses across boundaries. On the German side, corps staffs centralised control of scarce assault guns and motor transport, moving them between regiments daily to meet Soviet thrusts. Where strong points were overrun, local counterattacks aimed to recover specific buildings or crossroads rather than entire villages, accepting partial control if road denial could be maintained. The psychological toll of stalemate manifested in the language of unit reports. Soviet accounts from rifle regiments described corridor duty as the most demanding assignment, requiring continuous labour to repair roads under artillery interdiction and constant readiness to repel flank attacks. German diaries from infantry battalions referred to forest warfare that combined prolonged listening for sapper work at night with sudden close-range firefights at dawn. Neither narrative recorded triumphalist themes. Both emphasized routine, attrition, and the weight of small decisions: when to move a gun team, whether to risk a daylight resupply, how long to hold a forward house before falling back to a main trench line. By late April, adaptation reached its limits without external change. Soviet staffs could refine assault groups, standardize fire procedures, and push liaison forward, but they could not widen the Volkov corridor or transform swamp tracks into all-weather roads within the available time. German divisions could perfect counterattack drills and maintain strong points, but they faced rising losses in junior leaders and increasing strain on horse and vehicle fleets. The cumulative effect was equilibrium unfavourable to the force exposed deepest in the salient. As pressure increased on the corridor, the same systems that had enabled temporary advances, pre-registered fires, assault group tactics, and liaison nodes, shifted to a covering function, buying time for withdrawal plans that required more transport capacity than the route could support. Adaptation had preserved combat power and control on both sides, but it could not substitute for structural advantages in supply and manoeuvre that would determine the next phase. The collapse of the Lyuban operation unfolded gradually between May and June 1942 as the balance between tactical endurance and logistical exhaustion tipped irreversibly. The thaw transformed supply routes into continuous swamps. The corridor linking Second Shock Army to the east bank of the Volkhov, never wider than 5 kilometers, deteriorated under daily German shell fire and air attacks. Trucks bogged down. Horses sank in the mud. Bridges were rebuilt nightly with felled trees and destroyed again each morning. Communication cables were cut by artillery fragments faster than they could be spliced. Reports from frontline regiments described rations reduced to a few ounces of bread per day and artillery batteries firing their last shells before dismantling breach blocks to prevent capture. Inside the salient, isolation was a physical fact rather than a metaphor. German 18th Army, reorganised for the counteroffensive, concentrated several infantry and security divisions to seal the breach. By mid-May, attacks from the south at Myasnoye Bor and from the north near Spasskoye began to close the corridor. Soviet attempts to reopen it combined local counterattacks by rifle divisions of 59th Army and artillery barrages directed by the Volkhov Front headquarters. Guns firing from east of the river saturated the approaches to the corridor, but accuracy fell as observation posts were lost and smoke from burning forests obscured landmarks. Supply aircraft dropped containers into clearings at night, but losses from ground fire were high. The Luftwaffe maintained daytime control of the air, striking at crossings and ammunition depots. German reports noted that Soviet counterattacks showed fanatical persistence but diminishing coordination, a reflection of command breakdowns caused by the isolation of the Second Shock Army headquarters west of the Volkhov. Within the pocket, discipline and routine held remarkably long. Artillery units husbanded their remaining shells for defensive barrages. Small teams maintained improvised radio contact with the East Bank using truck batteries as power sources. Field hospitals were organized in dugouts. Surgeons operated without anesthesia when supplies ran out. Kulik's earlier insistence on conserving ammunition through pre-planned barrages now took on a literal meaning. Every gun had a fixed quota, every shell a target. Infantry companies entrenched on small rises above the swamp held positions until ammunition ran out, then withdrew at night through water waist deep. Commanders improvised bridges from logs and pontoons cut from barrels. For weeks, the front inside the pocket remained dynamic, a series of shrinking arcs as battalions shifted positions to cover evacuations and to destroy equipment before it fell to the enemy. By the end of May, the German encirclement was nearly complete. Soviet efforts to relieve the pocket from the east achieved temporary openings no wider than 1 or 2 kilometers, immediately under artillery fire. Evacuation proceeded in small groups, wounded carried on doors, officers burning codebooks, gun crews spiking their weapons. German accounts from the period described the discovery of abandoned guns in waterlogged positions, with ammunition still in crates beside them, evidence that retreat had been a matter of hours rather than days. Soviet casualty figures remain uncertain. Estimates suggest that out of roughly 130,000 men of Second Shock Army committed west of the Volkhov, fewer than 1/3 broke out or were evacuated. The rest were killed or captured in the closing battles of June 1942. Among the captured were several senior officers, while the army's commander, General Andrei Vlasov, disappeared from contact and later surfaced as a prisoner, a fact that would acquire political resonance far beyond the battlefield. The destruction of the Second Shock Army had immediate operational and psychological consequences. The Volkhov Front's offensive capability was blunted for months. 54th Army, exhausted from repeated attempts to break through, reverted to defense along the Emgar-Kirishi sector. For the German 18th Army, the victory stabilized the southern approaches to Leningrad and allowed the redeployment of divisions to other sectors. Yet the terrain and the cost of the operation limited exploitation. Reports from German corps noted that advancing through the swamps yielded minimal spoils beyond prisoners and damaged guns. Evacuation of their own wounded was as difficult as for the enemy. Artillery expenditure during the encirclement had reached record levels for a local operation, exceeding allocations and straining ammunition transport. Both sides recorded exhaustion rather than triumph. For the Soviet command, the disaster triggered a new cycle of inquiries. Stavka ordered commissions to review the planning, coordination, and logistics of the Lyuban operation. Kulik, as the commander of the 54th Army during the critical phase, became a central figure in these investigations. Transcripts of debriefings record recurring themes: inadequate liaison between the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts, underestimation of terrain difficulties, delays in shifting artillery fire to counter German counterattacks, and the failure to ensure stable communications between advancing formations. Kulik's own reports defended his actions, citing insufficient support, poor weather, and the impossibility of moving heavy guns through impassable swamps. The inquiries did not single out one individual, but identified systemic coordination failures. Nonetheless, in the atmosphere of 1942, accountability carried political weight, and Kulik's earlier standing as a pre-war marshal made him an obvious target for criticism. In the broader strategic context, the Lyuban failure coincided with preparations for German summer offensives in the south. Stavka shifted resources to the Moscow and Voronezh directions, leaving the northern fronts with limited reinforcements. The Red Army as a whole entered a period of retrenchment and reorganization. The experience of the Volkov campaign informed changes in command procedures, the creation of stronger communication units, and the simplification of offensive planning to match logistical means. The lessons extracted: avoid narrow salients, ensure multiple supply routes, assign artillery by echelon, became doctrine later that year. In this sense, the catastrophe contributed to adaptation, though at enormous human cost. For those trapped in the pocket, the months that followed imprisonment or escape were shaped by survival rather than policy. Captured Soviet soldiers were sent to camps in occupied territories, many perishing from disease or starvation. Those who broke out joined depleted units reorganizing east of the river, or were reassigned to other fronts after brief rest. The civilian population in the surrounding villages endured reprisals and forced labor as German engineers converted the battlefield into a fortified zone. The remnants of the front stabilized along the Volkhov for the remainder of 1942, transforming the area into one of static attrition rather than maneuver. Artillery duels across the river became daily routine, each side firing thousands of shells to disrupt road repair and depot construction. The forests that had swallowed armies now echoed with sporadic bombardments, marking a transition from offensive to endurance warfare. Within the Soviet command apparatus, the Lyuban episode accelerated the decline of figures associated with pre-war caution and the early disasters. Kulik's reputation, already eroded by previous disputes over mechanization, suffered irreparably. Though he remained nominally in service, his authority was curtailed. Other officers with field success or political backing rose to prominence in artillery and tank commands. Yet his earlier institutional influence lingered. The standardization of calibers, the emphasis on centralized fire control, and the insistence on logistics as the foundation of firepower became enduring features of Soviet practice. The paradox of his career, technical foresight combined with strategic rigidity, was crystallized by the fate of the Lyuban operation, a battle where artillery dominated the landscape but could not overcome the physical and logistical limits of its own system. The turning point had arrived, and with it the beginning of Kulik's irreversible political descent. Retreat from the Lyuban salient did not end with a single order, but with a sequence of withdrawals, demolitions, and rearguard actions that ran into July 1942. Rifle regiments assigned to cover the exits west of the Volkhov reduced their loads to ammunition and medical kits. Field kitchens, bridging material, and immobile guns were destroyed in place. Engineer detachments blew culverts along forest tracks to slow German patrols, closing from the north and south. Artillery commanders left skeleton crews with time fuses to burn remaining propellant and to wreck breech blocks before night crossings. Evacuation priorities reflected the state of the corridor. Lightly wounded moved first by boat, where water would bear the weight. Stretcher cases were transferred last, and often abandoned when fire cut the banks. German units recorded clashes with small withdrawal groups rather than mass capitulations. Prisoner counts rose sharply only after the corridor was severed and ammunition in isolated pockets ran out. When the front stabilized east of the river, both commands undertook immediate measures to consolidate. The Volkhov front reorganized into new echelons: barrier detachments to secure crossings, artillery groups positioned to prevent fresh German probes, and repair battalions to restore the shattered road net. Divisions reduced to a few thousand rifles were withdrawn for reconstitution or merged. Shortages were systemic: prime movers, radios, and medical supplies, but manpower began to flow from the interior districts where new levies were ready. German 18th Army, now holding a shortened line, rotated regiments to secondary sectors and rebuilt its ammunition stocks after expenditure that had exceeded peacetime monthly allotments several times over. Horses were culled due to exhaustion. Vehicle fleets required overhauls after weeks of hauling through swamps. Reports from Corps staffs noted that gains in ground were measurable in kilometers. but gains in operational freedom were limited by the same terrain that had hindered the attackers. Administrative consequences followed quickly. Commissions from the High Command reviewed orders, liaison logs, and radio traffic from January to June. Timelines reconstructed when and how coordination between the 2nd Shock Army and the 54th Army broke down, with particular attention to the intervals between requests for artillery lifts and the arrival of fires on specified targets. The findings emphasized that a single narrow supply route made the plan sensitive to delay at any point, bridge failure, loss of an observation post, or a 24-hour lag in ammunition delivery. Responsibility was distributed across planning and execution echelons. Front headquarters for setting an objective disproportionate to engineer resources. Army staffs for insufficient redundancy in communications. Corps Command for committing reserves without secured lateral roads. Kulik's explanations stressed the intractability of the ground and the attrition of artillery tractors. The reviewing panels acknowledged these factors, while noting that the risk calculus inherent in the plan had not been revised as Thaw approached. Operational doctrine absorbed the outcome in several concrete changes during late 1942. Offensive plans required at least 2 independent supply corridors before deep penetration. Artillery schedules mandated reserve concentrations to counter interdiction against forward dumps. Engineer troops received priority for bridging materials and corduroy planks. Communications tables increased the authorized number of wire reels and field telephones per battalion. Anti-tank defense at rifle division level was strengthened by increasing the density of 45mm guns and issuing large numbers of 14.5mm rifles to create layered fields of fire in forests. Guards, mortar units expanded and were assigned to front and army reserves rather than embedded piecemeal. These measures did not guarantee success, but reduced single-point failures that had characterized the Lyuban salient. Civilian effects of withdrawal were immediate. Villages on the east bank absorbed evacuees from units and from the pocket itself, straining food stocks already low due to requisitions and the priority of shipments to sieged urban centres. Labour detachments rebuilt wharves and winter roads under artillery harassment. Medical posts treated frostbite and trench foot alongside wounds. On the German side, occupation authorities extended field rail spurs to support newly fortified belts. Wood, peat and food were requisitioned, and local men were taken as porters to move supplies across terrain where vehicles failed. Partisan activity in forests south of the main corridor increased, forcing the allocation of additional security companies and reducing the tactical reserves available to counterattacks by the regular Red Army. Command careers were affected in different ways. Some officers moved laterally or upward after showing competence in organising withdrawals and re-establishing lines. Others were removed for failing to preserve their formations. Kulik's record as the commander responsible for the 54th Army during attempts to break the encirclement drew the scrutiny of both military and political organs. He was relieved and reassigned. His rank and decorations were reviewed in light of pre-war decisions and wartime performance. The process did not rest on a single verdict from Lyuban, but folded that experience into a broader assessment of his opposition to rapid mechanization, his procurement positions in 1939 to 1941, and his field command outcomes in 1941 to 1942. The cumulative effect was a decline in authority and access to senior command roles. The withdrawal also reframed German expectations. Reports to Army Group North concluded that Soviet forces could assemble and move large groupings through forest and swamp, but were constrained by logistics to narrow axes. The recommended countermeasure remained the rapid cutting of corridors, followed by artillery interdiction of crossings. At the same time, German staff studies warned that prolonged defence in the region would consume divisions through sickness and attrition even in periods of operational success, and that rail lines to Munger and Tosno remained vulnerable to sustained bombardment from the East Bank and from the Leningrad side. By late 1942, Headquarters notes anticipated renewed Soviet efforts once ICE returned, and advised prepositioning engineer materials to repair bridges under fire. Inside the Soviet system, the narrative of Lyuban shifted from an attempted relief of a city to a cautionary example used in staff colleges. Map exercises emphasized the need for echeloned objectives and for artillery observation plans that did not rely on a single line of towers or tree stands. Courses for army and front artillery chiefs added modules on establishing redundant fire direction centers and on planning ammunition economies for multi-week operations. Tank brigades assigned to forest sectors trained in short-bound advances under mortar smoke with standardized requests for 3-minute lifts and 10-minute interdictions on road forks. These adjustments, while technical, changed how staffs wrote orders and how formations rehearsed. The political sphere registered the disaster in personnel files and in the language of citations. Awards from the Lyuban period tended to recognize acts of extraction and defense under isolating fire, rebuilding a bridge under bombardment, evacuating casualties across a collapsing crossing, rather than breakthroughs. Correspondence between commissars and front commanders highlighted the need to explain to troops why the operation had been undertaken and how future attempts would differ. The tone was neither celebratory nor condemnatory. It was functional, aiming to preserve cohesion after a costly failure without assigning singular blame that could fracture chains of command. As summer 1942 progressed, attention shifted south to the Volga and the Caucasus, but the northern fronts continued to absorb resources for defense and preparation. Artillery duels across the Volkhov became routine. Depots were dispersed and camouflaged. Night movement was standard. When ICE returned in late 1942 and early 1943, the operational approach reflected the lessons drawn: shorter objectives, parallel axes of advance, heavier initial engineer allocation, and tighter coupling between artillery observation and fire direction. In January 1943, a different operation on the Leningrad axis achieved a narrow land corridor to the city, an outcome that underlined a continuity rather than a reversal. The same adversaries, similar terrain, but a revised balance between intention and means. Against that backdrop, the Lyuban withdrawal stood as the closing chapter of a campaign whose costs were borne by riflemen, sappers, gun crews and civilians, and whose institutional aftershocks shaped the conduct of northern operations for the rest of the year. The legacy of Grigory Kulik sits at the intersection of institutional learning, political retribution, and post-war memory. In the military sphere, the immediate effect of the 1941 to 1942 experience was a decisive turn toward coherent, mechanized formations with integral logistics and signals, coupled to larger and more centralized artillery groupings. Mechanized corps were rebuilt during 1942 to 1943, then elevated to tank corps and tank armies with organic repair echelons, radio nets, and fuel trains, while front and army artillery reserves standardized fire planning, observation, and ammunition economies. These structures embodied lessons that Lyuban had underlined in the most painful terms. No single narrow corridor, no deep penetration without parallel supply routes, and no maneuver without communications dense enough to carry orders in minutes rather than hours. They also reflected, in part, elements Kulik had long advocated, notably caliber standardization, centralized control of artillery, and priority for engineer assets. The paradox is that the institutional settlement combined his emphasis on fire and logistics with the very mechanized mass he'd resisted when system could not yet support it. On the northern axis, the contrast between the Lyuban failure and Operation Iskra in January 1943 captured this synthesis. The later plan shortened objectives, doubled engineer allocations, created redundant lines of supply, and synchronized Guards mortar regiments, corps artillery, and tank brigades on parallel axes. The result was a land corridor to Leningrad measured in kilometers rather than meters, and sustained by overlapping roads and rail spurs. German assessments from 1943 acknowledged that Soviet staffs had converted attritional experience into operational method, reducing the vulnerability to interdiction that had made the Second Shock Army's salient untenable. Civilian outcomes tracked the same change, where Lyuban had ended with tens of thousands lost in encirclement and disruption of the Ladoga lifeline. Iskra's corridor stabilized food deliveries and evacuations even under continued fire. In historiography, Kulik's pre-war orders on mechanization remain a focal point. The dissolution of the late 1930s, mechanized corps was justified on grounds of training, maintenance, and radio shortages, and it temporarily improved divisional artillery supply and rifle division support. Yet by 1940 to 1941, when neighbouring armies demonstrated the operational leverage of concentrated armour, the same policy limited the Red Army's ability to deliver coordinated counterblows. The reauthorization of 29 mechanized corps in early 1941, undertaken despite acknowledged shortfalls, expressed an institutional attempt to rejoin that race. The gap between authorization and readiness, visible in June 1941 lost statistics and in the performance of newly formed corps, became central to post-war debates over responsibility. Documents from Stavka conferences and directorate files show that Kulik's objections were framed in logistical arithmetic rather than in ideology, but the operational outcome made those objections appear as obstruction when judged against wartime needs. Kulik's field record in 1941 to 1942 added to the controversy. As a Stavka representative and later as commander of the 54th Army, he oversaw sectors where artillery could impose delays and shape local fights, yet could not achieve operational linkage across the Lyuban corridor. Investigations after the destruction of Second Shock Army cited systemic failures in inter-army liaison, engineer support, and communications redundancy. Kulik's own submissions emphasized terrain and transport limits. The findings informed doctrine without endorsing any single interpretation of accountability, but within the political atmosphere of 1942, they contributed to a decline in his standing. He was removed from senior command, and the authority he had wielded over procurement and artillery policy in 1939 to 1941 passed to officers aligned with the mechanized rebuild and with expanded Guards mortar formations. The political afterlife of the case extended beyond the battlefield. In the late 1940s, NKVD investigations broadened into proceedings against alleged conspiratorial groups. Kulik, already marginalized, was arrested and in 1950 convicted on charges of anti-state activity and executed. The record indicates a combination of wartime grievances, institutional rivalries, and the climate of post-war purges, rather than a demonstrable military conspiracy. After the political thaw of the mid-1950s, prosecutorial reviews revisited these cases, and Kulik was posthumously rehabilitated. The reversal did not resolve military judgments on his pre-war and wartime decisions, but it separated the legal verdict from broader questions about doctrine and performance. From the German perspective, reports from Army Group North and 18th Army that covered 1941 to 1942 and later years drew a consistent lesson. Soviet forces could generate mass and resilience under extreme conditions, but their success depended on whether staff work translated that mass into redundancy in supply and communications. German studies of Lyuban recommended immediate interdiction of corridors and lateral counterattacks against flanks, methods that had worked in 1942 but proved costlier in 1943 when Soviet plans multiplied axes and thickened artillery coverage. German rear area files also recorded the civilian dimension of the Northern Theatre, labour requisitions, vulnerability of rail lines to bombardment, and the strain on divisions immobilized in forests, elements that narrowed the margin for sustained offensive action, even in operational success. For civilians, the legacy was measured in survival odds. The failure at Lyuban meant another year of siege conditions in Leningrad, with mortality counted in hundreds of thousands before the partial relief of 1943 and the full lifting of the siege in 1944. Villages along the Volkhov bore the long imprint of fortification belts, minefields, and artillery debris. Post-war reconstruction plans prioritized rail and bridge repair on routes that wartime logistics had elevated to strategic significance. Memory in these communities centered on road building under fire, evacuation across ice, and the endurance of medical and supply services as much as on the movements of divisions. In professional military education, the Kulik question became a case study rather than a verdict. Staff colleges and artillery academies used the 1939 to 1942 sequence to teach risk management in force design. When to consolidate around standard calibers, when to accept rapid adoption of new systems, how to scale formations to the communications and maintenance base, and how to avoid plans that hinge on single points of failure. Comparative figures from 1941 counterstrokes, 1942 Lyuban exchanges, and 1943 operations on the same axis provided a data set to argue that doctrine must be iterative, absorbing field evidence without allowing early caution to harden into strategic limits. The broader historical significance lies in how institutions convert shock into structure. The Red Army that crossed into Germany in 1944 to 1945 bore the imprint of both sides of the pre-war debate. Artillery mass and standardization delivered by deep logistics, and mechanized operational art sustained by radios, repair echelons, and fuel stocks. Kulik's career threaded through these outcomes in contradictory ways. His advocacy for standardization and centralized fire control became durable features. His resistance to premature, mechanized mass was vindicated under 1940 conditions, but became an impediment when the institution chose to accelerate regardless. The Lyuban disaster did not begin with him and did not end with him. It emerged from the collision of terrain, logistics, and command coordination, and it pushed the system toward the combination of fire and movement that later operations achieved. In the end, the record supports neither simple condemnation nor rehabilitation as a military theorist. It documents a practitioner of artillery who tried to align procurement and doctrine with what factories and depots could supply, who failed as operational commander in a theatre where speed and parallel routes were required, and who fell victim to a political process that punished perceived disloyalty more than it weighed technical nuance. The legacy is a layered one, a caution against designing forces beyond their support, a reminder that operational success demands redundant pathways for orders and supply, and a demonstration that wartime institutions can integrate competing ideas only after field experience exposes where each is valid.